Good afternoon. See you out in rows. So, last time we fell somewhat behind. Since we're behind, we only have today before our next class. We'll drop the reading that we were supposed to discuss today, but won't discuss today for the exam. So the exam will cover everything up until, well, everything since the last exam up to Chapter 2 of Altman and Wellman. So it'll be Rousseau in Chapter 2. And so we'll just finish discussing Chapter 2 today. And we should be in position. Tamir?
So, will there be more material on the third exam?
Excuse me?
Yeah. Since this won't be, we're going to have a chapter 2 cover, our next exam will be adding the stuff we could.
So generally speaking, an exam covers everything that was discussed and read since the previous exam. So I don't anticipate that the stuff that we won't get to today I'll lift to next week, in which case it just drops out. So for Thursday, a week from now, we will start discussing intervention, if I remember correctly. And so the next exam, the third exam, will just be dealing with intervention. Did that help?
Yeah, that helps.
So I think the simple answer is no, but that's are we communicating? Okay. All right. Okay, so we're looking here at the attack that Altman and Wellman are posing against thinking of self-determination, or the right of self-determination, as something that requires democracy. Right? So we've seen that Rousseau wants to connect those two. For Rousseau, self-determination absolutely does require democracy, because self-determination is something that has to do with freedom, both individual freedom and collective freedom. And that type of freedom is possible only under a system in which people give themselves the laws to which they're subject. And to be lawgivers and subject to the law, you have to live in a democracy, he thinks. So that's the only place where you get the circle, right? Where you're both legislator and subject or citizen at the same time. And then you get all the other additional arguments, right, about freedom, autonomy, independence, and so on. That's how Rousseau fills out that story. And Altman and Wellman tried to attack this idea. They don't address Rousseau per se, but they address a number of Rousseau-style arguments. They address the argument from autonomy. We saw that before, right? That it's the claim that they have about, can we say that a group will is constituted out of or made up out of the individual autonomous wills of the subject? They say no, because for someone to be an autonomous decision maker, they have to have an actual causal influence on whatever it is they're making a decision about. And individual people in a society, even democratic society, have absolutely no causal influence on the political decisions. So we talked a bunch about whether both those steps in the argument are true, right? There's an empirical claim there about how much your influence you have. They say it's very negligible. It's an empirical claim. And then there is a moral claim, or a sort of more conceptual, philosophical claim, that for your will to be an autonomous will about something, you have to have causal effects or causal influence on that thing. And we talked about whether that's a correct principle or not. They address a number of other arguments too, the ones that we won't discuss here, but they are important. They talk about equality, for example. Like Rousseau, of course, thinks equality is super important. And they think democracy is not required by equality. You can fully honor the ideal of equality without thereby being committed to democracy. There's other systems that can honor equality as well, and so on. So where we left off was I was trying to give you an account of, I was trying to fill out some details about that Altman and Wellman don't give you, which is how is it possible if we're still going to be believing in something like value individualism, so if we're still going to hold on to the principle that anything that matters, morally speaking, must be based on or translatable to individual values and so on. And how might you believe that a group can have a collective will under that, and give you this little chart, right, with the three people or the three justices on a tribunal, for example, where they cannot come up with a rational way of making decisions, even if they're just simple on the simple majority rule. But it turns out to be under any decision-making rule, unless they give the group some sort of autonomy of making decisions. So whichever way you slice it, simple majority addition would lead to inconsistencies, right? Lead to just irrational decision-making, contradictions. You can't have those. So to get out of them, you have to get some type of group autonomy. But the group's decision, even the autonomous group decisions, are still based on each of the individual persons or individual justices' decisions. So that's one way you might think, you might show that this is actually possible, what they're talking about. All right. So that was the first issue we're talking about. How is this even possible? Second issue, okay, if it's going to be justified in individualist terms, then why not require democracy? So the autonomy point is we saw already, but if it goes back to this individualist type of influence, should it not really be democratic? And so here's like a positive argument that Altman and Wellman give. So this is their argument for why the answer to that should be no. They say the answer is no. And here's why. So if you remember, right, the chapter takes the following form. The way they often do this, right, method in terms of a method. They say, here is the question we're going to be addressing. Here is our answer. That usually takes only like a page or 5, maybe 8 or something. And then they start addressing all sorts of reasons you might think, or might come up with, or people have come up with, all sorts of reasons to doubt what they're saying. And they start knocking them down. Right? So they say, should self-determination require democracy? No, this is the positive argument. We'll get to that. And then they go, well, maybe you think autonomy throws a spanner in the works. Right? Maybe you think equality messes things up. No. Autonomy, no. Equality, no. Maybe there's a human right to democracy. No. Right? So they go through all these objections and start knocking them down. That's their method. All right, so here's the positive argument, right? Summarized. So simply stated, the right to democracy is based on the claim that, quote, only the people have a right to rule over society. That's what ultimately the right to self-determination is about. It's only the people having a right to rule themselves, that society that they're a part of. And the decision to abandon democracy is actually a decision, it's itself also a decision about how to rule over society. And so therefore it follows that the people can choose to forgo their right to democracy by exercising their right to rule over society, which just is the right to self-determination. And so here's a quote, right? As long as it adequately respects human rights, because that's just a standard clause, right? You think you can't, any moral right is going to be restricted by the human rights of other people, including the moral right to self-determination. But as long as you don't do that, as long as you don't violate human rights, you pretty much get to do whatever you like, including abolishing democracy. Any Rousseauians in here? How do you think Rousseau or Rousseauian follower of Rousseau would object to this? Can you think of any problems with this? Mike?
In essence, I don't really feel there's been as means of being overridden by anything else, because whatever they replace is basically democracy, and it can also still be taken away from democracy. So in the end, there's still kind of de facto in total agreeing with whoever they appoint, whatever type of government, whatever
So is this some? If I'm Altman and Wellman, where are you pushing on like my argument here?
Even though the Altman and Wellman are trying to say that democracy is kind of overturned for, say, monarchy,
Okay.
it's not really, because it's that democracy is still ruling over how the people would live in our government.
Good. So it's like you're. Am I understanding you correctly if I say, like, summarize it like this? You think like Altman and Wellman are kind of overselling their point a little. They say we allow self-determination allows you to abolish democracy, but actually some kind of democracy still has to exist even for them. Right. Interesting. Do you think that's right? Should they say that some kind of democracy should still, like, is that still? What if the people just abolish that too? So you say like there's a monarchy, but the people keep the right to go back to some other type of government, right? So I propose a referendum, right, as a citizen of this country. I say let's get rid of that right to go back. I just want monarchy, full stop. Good. So we have let's say that we have a sequence of events, right? So we start with the society. It's just full-on democracy. A referendum gets held. The referendum says, should we become a monarchy? Right? Yes or no. Majority of people vote yes, but only if it's a monarchy with some type of right that if we hold another referendum, we can go back to democracy. Right? That's the Allman and Wellman view. Right? But that's okay. Okay, so we're now there. Now I, the same citizen, say, actually, I like this. It's better than democracy, but I haven't quite gotten everything I want. What I want is monarchy without even that chance of a referendum. And so here's my argument, right? The right to the referendum, right, is based on the right that only the people have to rule over society. The decision to abandon the referendum is a decision to how to rule over the society. Therefore, and it seems equally valid, potentially equally sound. What about that? Shay?
Isn't it like democracy when they decide to take away the referendum? Like when they all come together and make a vote towards it. So at one point, isn't it contradictory, I guess?
Not quite following.
Like you said, if they want to take away, if they're in a monarchy and they have a referendum to go back to democracy, and the monarch is like, yeah, and when they have that referendum, isn't that all of them having their own ideas and voting towards a certain, I guess, goal, and that would be like democracy. So
Yeah, but I'm saying like, okay, now I want to get rid of even the chance of having a referendum. So I want to have one more referendum, and the topic of this referendum is no more voting, like we already have, but we still have these referendums like we're having today, right? But this referendum says, in addition to no more voting, I also want no more referendum. So just have a king. And Chantal?
Kind of accept that if that form of government is still protecting and respecting the human rights, because, like they said, what we read before, sovereignty doesn't mean democracy. So you have a king that one is fully respecting and protecting human rights. That's I guess I think.
Legitimate. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah, well, the question, so they don't say that, right? But the question, I'm wondering, should they say that? Claudia?
But they do answer kind of to that, because they say that society changes over the years, and so you can't forever decide something now, but the society in, for example, 50 years. So they actually say that you can't have a referendum that stops all future referendums from happening because society changes and the people in the society changing their ideas of what they want as a government function.
Good. Yeah. And so if the no referendum policy is accepted, so what's the problem with that? Just to finish the thought, you're on the right track.
Then the generation that decides that at the moment is self-determinant, but the generations that are coming aren't because they were forced to just live under the government that.
Right. And so the idea is then that their right to their people's rights to rule over the society is thereby denied or something, right? Yeah. Chantal?
On that statement between us, I don't want to anymore, and then you guys are going to discuss it with whoever in government next. Like, actually, I do want to, would that still kind of show that the changing, society changing, and I don't know where I'm going with this.
Can you try it again? Okay. Anthony?
Is it legal to make a law that can't be turned over?
In our society, you mean?
Yeah.
No, I mean the strongest we have are constitutional. It's the Constitution, right, which requires a lot to overturn. But
be like turned over plausibly, but it would just take so much effort.
Right. Yes. So it's was it ratified by 2/3 of the states, and then 2 times, I think, right? So, yeah. So 4 years apart or something. So there has to be an election cycle between it. So. But it's possible. I mean,
So we don't have a right.
the last one we had was in the 60s, right? The Civil Rights Act was the so that's it. They did it, but it doesn't happen a lot because it's hard. I interrupted you. I'm sorry. What were you saying?
I was just thinking, like, so we don't have the moral, like, ability to create something that can't be turned over. As well as, like, you don't have that right to create something to where, like she was saying, like, generations after they can't turn it over.
Right. Yes, not in our society. And then the Ullman and Wellman say that the right to self-determination requires that that's not possible. And then what we were asking was, well, why would we think that? And Claudia suggested, well, because there's going to be these subsequent generations who are going to be just trapped under that rule, and they now don't have the power to rule over themselves anymore. So fully, if we were being sticklers, right, we'd have to fill this out in some way, saying like, the right to democracy is based on the claim that only the people have a right to rule over society, sort of over time or something, right, or like over different generations. And then the decision to abandon democracy might be a decision how to rule society over different generations, as long as you can overturn this, right, as a subsequent generation can. But you couldn't say that about a referendum, because the subsequent generations wouldn't have any say anymore. So that's going to be. Reggie?
So what is the difference between Altman and Wellman and Russo?
Good question. Do you want to try and?
No,
And that?
because as it's stated right there, it sounds like the same thing as a social contract. That's why when they say they can forego their right to democracy but rule of society, but isn't the social contract like as far as people's the rational will or the general will of people, and everybody will live in this harmonious society and
Yeah.
yeah.
No, good. No, it's an excellent question. Jay, do you want to try?
Yeah, I wanted to try.
Go.
So, Russo's idea of self-determination is that it needs democracy, and that's different from Altman and Wellman. And the citizens, they have to give up their rights into a social contract, and that's when they'll get new rights from the new society that they form. And while they're in that new society, they'll have their own democracy. While Altman and Wellman, they believe that you can have a society that doesn't function based on democracy. It only matters as long as people's rights are being respected. And if the people don't want to be ruled by democracy, then they won't be ruled by democracy.
Yeah, good. So those are important differences. So, were you wondering about that, or were you wondering about like why would those differences exist?
Even with what we just said, even if they forego their right to democracy, it's still right to rule of society. So you're still saying the people are still ruling society, and it's the general will because everybody's you have like a certain percentage of the good side of people that's going to rule over society.
Yeah, well, that last part is that's where the rub is, right? So you're definitely right that Altman and Wellman say that if the people abolish democracy, they are still thereby exercising and retain their right to rule over society, because they can go back, right? But Rousseau would not think that that was consistent with freedom or self-determination, for that matter. And it's part of that is that after you abolish the democracy, you can't really assume anymore. You can't really know. You can probably not even expect that the laws of society will capture the general will. So, because for the general will to be produced for him, if you remember, you have to go through this process of democratic deliberation, right? In which you propose things in a general way. You don't try and rig a law to your own advantage and stuff, and you can't, right? And so that brings out the better parts of yourself, the more rational and the more impartial parts of yourself. And all that is gone, right, as soon as you abolish a democracy, because now it's a group of clergymen, or it's a king, or elders, or whoever, right, who are now doing the ruling. And they rule as they see fit, and they might try very hard to be rational, but there's no guarantee. And it's their wills, not all of ours, that are doing it. So that couldn't do it for Rousseau. For Rousseau, you have to have this ongoing process of self-rule and self-legislating, where you're quite literally producing the laws yourself that you're under. And as soon as you abolish democracy, you lose that, he thinks. The other points that Shea made were good too, by the way. Like the rights point, for example, is very, very important, right? So where for Rousseau, all the rights that you have to be submitted to or subjected to the community's authority. And the only rights that you can insist on against people or against the government are the rights that the community decides on, so that the law gives you. And of course, for Altman and Wellman, that's very different, right? Because they want to have this independent standard of human rights by which we get to judge the law, right? And we say the law is wrong when it violates human rights. And that, for Rousseau, you can't have any of that. Right? So that's anathema to Rousseau's theory. Yeah, sorry, Shane.
I just remembered an extra part of Rousseau's theory that for when it comes to the society, how would they call it?
Social contract?
Yeah, social contract.
Right.
There we go. When it comes to making laws, everybody has to agree upon it. And yeah, they have to make laws based on everybody's general will.
Mm-hmm.
And if one person doesn't agree with it, then it won't apply to everybody's general will, and then they can't get that law passed. But they have to keep changing it. While in Altman and Wellman's theory, as long as the people at the top are making sure human rights are being respected, then if they make a law and it's still respecting human rights, but people don't like it, they just have to deal with it, I guess.
Right, good. Yes, so there's a key importance between, like a very important difference between how Altman and Wellman and Rousseau think about the right of the people to rule over themselves. So for Rousseau, that is, like, again, very literally, you being involved in the production of the laws under which you live. And that's the important part. I remember how he starts the social contract. He says, like how you're born free, but you're in chains, like you're constricted by the law. How did it happen? I can't tell you. How might it be legitimate? That's what I'm going to tell you. Right? So you can say, like, how is it possible that the things that constrain you are still consistent with your freedom? And his answer is, well, because you're giving it to yourself, right, in a rational, autonomous, free way. And of course, this here, a referendum is very different from a Rousseau-style democracy, right? So a referendum is, well, a majority, maybe a super majority. Let's say that 70% want to abolish democracy. Or maybe at the time 100% want to abolish democracy, but now, 2 generations later, 80% still wants it, and you don't. Right? You're part of the 20% who opposes. Well, that's the stuff that you just have to put up with. Right? As long as your human rights aren't being violated, you really don't have any complaint. And so there is an idea there about what the people are doing that is much more sort of, that allows for a lot more disagreement and diversity in the people and dissent, really, in the people than Rousseau would. Right? For Rousseau, it has to be that every individual person can actually see the law as freely imposed on themselves. So if you live in this society, right, and you look at the law that you're living by, and you ask yourself, is this the law that I can freely, rationally, autonomously accept? And your answer is no. There's 2 options here, right? One, you're making a mistake, right? You should say, if you really thought about it correctly, the answer would really be yes. But if you're not making a mistake, if you really are correctly thinking about it, and still the answer is no, then you're not free. Right? And so your autonomy is violated, and that, as soon as one person is not free, the whole thing is gone for Rousseau. Right? Because we can only be free, you're only free for all free. Right? We can't have any slaves in the society because we have to be completely equal. And so for Altman and Wellman, it's not like that at all. Right? You might be very upset, very unhappy with the way your society is being governed, but as long as you're not having your human rights abused, as long as you're in a minority, you kind of have to put up with it. They do think, by the way, like this is the stuff that we were originally supposed to talk about today, but do think that if you're in that kind of minority, you have a right to separate from the state and start your own state. But that's quite a different solution, of course. Rousseau doesn't allow any of that. Shay?
So, in Rousseau's theory, no referendums are held?
No, because everything goes up to just general vote. Right?
And in Altman and Wellman's theory, referendums are held along with majority vote being considered among the people.
Yeah, I'm not sure they give a particular account of the details of what the referendum would be like, but a majority vote could be, sometimes you get a referendum where it's a majority vote given that a certain number of people show up, right? Or it might be given that a number of people show up and it's a supermajority vote, so like at least 66%, for example, like that. So you could fill it out in different ways, but something like that, right? One of those would be enough. Yeah. Okay. This stuff about how Rousseau and Altman and Wellman compare it is not irrational to expect some of this to show up on Tuesday. All right. Any questions about it before we move on? All right. We've talked about that. All right. So let's go over this a little more. Rousseau thinks self-determination is this ongoing process, right? People exercising their freedom. Freedom understood as independence, but also autonomous self-rule that requires independence through the democratic politics. Right? And so therefore he thinks self-determination has to require democracy, and just summing up what we just talked about. Altman and Wellman, by contrast, think that self-determination is a political group of people living together as a political group, constrained by respecting individualist moral claims, so to speak, as human rights. That's why they think you cannot subject your rights to the community, right? They have to remain as this independent standard by which we can judge whether the community is a good one or a bad one. If you're a person and you're human right and you live in a society that claims the right to self-determination yet violates your human rights, you can now say, I don't have to go along with this because this is an illegitimate society. Why? Because my human rights are being violated. So there is an independent notion, an independent standard, moral standard that you can appeal to evaluate the rights, sort of the laws of your society. That's completely contrary to Rousseau. what that means is that for Altman and Wellman, if democracy matters, then it can only be a part of respecting the individualist claims, the human rights. Right? And so that's why they give arguments against the right to democracy in Chapter 2. So it's the idea that you might have an individualist moral claim, as you know, that in order to be respected as an individual by your society, you have to be given a vote. That's a possible argument you might not make. They say, no, that fails. We get by that. So it requires legitimate states but not democracy. And so noticeably, legitimacy itself does not require democracy. Right? So it's possible for non-democratic societies to exist, yet be legitimate, yet have sovereignty and so on. So that's much more Walzer style. Right? Rousseau wouldn't agree with this, and funny enough, on the other end of the spectrum, someone like Tesson would also not agree with this. All right. Forget about that. Okay. All right. A question. So, if there are no human rights to democracy, why not? Altman and Wellman give this example that involves shields and arrows. Last time, one of the reading questions I think was about that. Can anyone try and summarize quickly what the argument, like what the thing is? Do you remember? Yeah, Reggie.
It's talking about like a society which is rich, like you can afford, I guess this society can afford the shield, so never mind.
Okay. So there's an analogy that they draw, right, between human rights being like shields and certain threats to our well-being or safety being like arrows that fly at us, right?
So if you have a poor country, like if another country couldn't afford the shield, they would have, their human rights wouldn't be as far as taken care of, or so that would make it a non-legitimate state.
Yeah, good. Yeah. So the analogy goes like this, right? To say, suppose that people are shooting arrows at you, right? Presumably your human rights are being violated. It's really dangerous. You might get killed. So what's the human rights violation? Is it that you don't have a shield? So let's say like you can have a shield, we'll stop the arrows, right? So you'll be safe. So no, they say that's not a human rights violation, that you're not giving a shield. The human rights violation are the arrows. They should stop shooting arrows. It's true that the shield would make you safe, would protect you from the arrows, but that's not a good argument for showing that you have a human right to shields. It's only a good argument for showing that you have a human right that people don't shoot arrows at you. All right? What does this have to do with democracy? What's the analogy? Does anyone remember? Are you raising your hand or are you just puzzling it again? Yeah.
So they're saying that the shield...
I want to say Rachel, but I'm not sure.
Lydia.
No, Lydia, sorry.
The shield is democracy, and that you don't have a human rights right, but if you do have it, it includes a chance of having human rights.
Yes, exactly, yes. So this is supposed to be an argument against the idea that you have a human right to democracy. They say, look, there are all sorts of dangerous things that can happen to you in a society. And they happen a lot more in societies that are not democratic than they happen in societies that are democratic. Right? So being thrown in prison without due process, for example. Having your rights, your free speech rights violated. Right? Having your right to freedom of religion violated. All these things happen much, much more in non-democracies than they happen in democracies. Right? And so those are like the arrows, right? Those are threats to your safety. And so it's true that democracy protects you from these things. So like the shield. But say if you don't believe that the shield is something you have a human right to, then there's no more reason to believe that you have a human right to democracy. Even though both the shield and democracy protect you. What you have is a human right not to be imprisoned, not to be religiously discriminated against, not to be, and so on. But not a human right to democracy. That's the basic analogy. What do you think of the argument? Are you persuaded by that? People this is something that is actually being debated right now, right? So people are proposing that there might be a human right to democracy.
So the arrows are things that can happen to people, whether or not they're in a democratic and non-democratic society? Or they
Yeah. So they think that as they define human rights early in the book, it's like the human rights are rights against or protections from certain standard threats to human safety and basically sort of a basic dignity. Forgot the phrase, but like sort of a minimum level of human dignity. Basic decency, I think is the word. Yeah. Forgot the phrase. Yeah, and sorry. Oh, sorry.
If you don't have like a right to have a shield, then like what's that to say? Like you have to have someone to always come in for the people that don't have shields. Who's the enforcers of this thing? You know, like if they don't have shields, then someone else has to step up that has shields and arrows to protect them. So like who would like saying that you don't have a human right to democracy, and you end up in a situation where your human rights are violated, then who's the enforcement of that?
You mean of the human rights? Mm-hmm. Right. Good. Who do you think? What do you think?
You know, like UK or something like European nations, where like you have a bunch of nations together working to try to help other countries in trouble.
Yeah, that could be right. So we'll see next after this next exam. We'll see when they talk about intervention that Altman and Wellman are quite open to military intervention in countries where human rights violations are going on. They think the current state of the world is one in which we don't intervene enough. So places like Syria now there is an intervention going on, but they want to see that earlier or more. So yeah, that could be right. So it could be that other countries, of course, the people themselves might fight back too. You know, that you might try and revolt and overthrow the government that is trying to abuse your rights and so on. More or less, anyone who can do it, I think, is their view. Yeah. But doesn't follow, right, that outsiders now have to ensure that the people who are being abused then get to live under a democracy. What they have to ensure is that the human rights violations are going to stop, and that after they've stopped, that their right to self-determination is respected. But that means the people now get to choose to be a democracy or not. Jeff?
So would a state that is able to help that doesn't be held responsible for contributing to the human rights violations?
Well, that's a complicated question.
Right.
So.
But if Altman and Wellman think that you ought to intervene to stop human rights violations, right? Then
yeah, the argument they make is they think. So the current, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but the current international norm is that intervention is illegitimate, like it's not allowed, impermissible, it's prohibited, unless there is really extreme stuff going on, like in Syria now today, right? So unless there's really like mass killings, genocides, extreme civil wars, or something like that. And they think that's a norm that we should give up on. Now, what that means, only like, strictly speaking, is you think that there is suppose you want to intervene, right? Suppose you're the type of person or type of government, country that wants to intervene in places. Sometimes there's going to be a barrier to you doing so. What's the barrier? Well, the right to self-determination can be a barrier, right? Because remember, Altman and Wellman say if the U.S. wants to annex Canada, even though they might run Canada better than the Canadians are doing it, can't do it. There's this moral barrier. There's a right that the Canadians have to govern themselves. But if things are really, really horrible, right? Massacres, genocide, and so on, we've lost the right to self-determination ages ago. Right? So that barrier doesn't exist. Now you can go and intervene. But where the current system is, only in those cases can you go and intervene. They think that much less severe human rights violations already removed the barrier.
Oh,
So there are many, many more cases where if you want to intervene, it will be permissible for you to do so. You're not blocked by the right to self-determination.
right, because they've lost, the people have lost it.
Because there's human rights violations going on. Right. And that can happen well before we get to Syria level abuse.
Yeah.
Right. And so what they think is there's too many cases in which people claim that there's this right, this sovereignty right or right to self-determination that's blocking intervention when it really isn't. And so there are more cases where you can go in and intervene than...
Right, so human rights
Then
violation doesn't have to be genocide. It could be something
Exactly, to be minor.
less harmful to the people.
Right.
And
And then the only thing you have to ask, they say, is you have to ask whether will this actually help or not. Like, are you going to cause more harm than good? Yes, well then don't do it. Right?
yeah,
That's a bad idea. But if you can actually cause more good than harm by doing it, then yeah, go ahead.
and that's what the force. Right?
Yeah, you have to be pretty damn sure that you're actually going to be, yeah. And it might be that, depending on your moral theory again, like what the right way to think about this is, but it might be that it's not enough to just do a little bit more good than harm, that maybe you have to do much more good than harm to be justified in I tend to think so, that it has to be, because you're going to kill people, and to do that there better be a whole bunch of people you can save. And so, but it depends, right? If you're a straightforward utilitarian, you just think, if I can make more good than harm going in, then even if it's just one person more that I save, that's good enough.
Then it's good enough, right?
Yeah, I myself think that's too loose of a view, but that's
close,
a
you
debatable
can't
point.
guarantee, you know what I mean? It's hard to know when you're that close. It would be a bigger.
Well, for sure, yeah. But even if you could know, like then would be, I think it's still.
Still not good.
But that's debatable, right? If your utilitarianism gets dumped on a lot, but it's a respectable moral view. So, yeah. All right. All right. So here's basically the argument, right? So it's an argument about what human rights are that underlies this analogy, right? And shields and arrows analogy. Why don't you have a right to the shield? They think it's because the shield is like it's an indirect protection, right? Like what is there's a difference between a direct and an indirect way of being protected from getting killed by these arrows that are flying at you. The direct way would be to just remove the arrows, right? To not have the arrows there. Then that's arrows coming at you. What's the most direct way of stopping the threat is get rid of the arrows. There's an indirect way, which is you let the arrows fly, but now you produce some additional feature in addition to the arrows that blocks them from actually hurting you. Right? And their claim is what you have a right to is only this direct protection stuff, not the indirect one. I mean, it might be nice to have the shield. If the arrows are flying, it's definitely nice to have the shield. Right? But what you have a right to claim from other people is not that they give you shields, but is that they stop shooting arrows at you. So the idea is here, you only have rights to these direct things, not the indirect things. Including human rights. That's the first claim. It's a claim about what human rights are. It's debatable, right? But that's what they think. And then second, they say, well, democracy is like a shield, right? It's not itself a protection from something harmful. If you take away democracy, that itself is not. Like if you introduce non-democracy, right? If you introduce tyranny, that itself is not, or introduce monarchy, let's put it, say not tyranny, that's cooking the books. If you introduce a monarchy, that itself is not yet a harm to you. Unless they start violating your rights as well. But then that's the further step, unless they start violating your rights. So that's the thing you have a right against, the rights, like the imprisonments, the closing of your church, the discrimination, all these things, right? These are things that you have rights against. And a democracy might be a safer bet. You get a higher probability of those things not happening to you, but it's indirect, right? It's not itself a harm when your democracy is abolished. That, of course, that's something that they try to make good throughout the chapter, right? They say, well, might it be a harm to your autonomy? No. Right? Might it be a harm to your equality? No. And so on. And then follows that there's no human right to democracy. Right? So, two things here to note, right? Each of these claims is debatable. You might think that some of the earlier arguments fails. Maybe you are persuaded by someone like Cristiano, who they discuss, who thinks that to respect people as equals, this is something Rousseau also believes, right? If you respect people as equals, they have to live in a democracy. If you think that, then this has to be false, right? Because actually, if as soon as you remove the democracy, there's this direct threat to because your equality is being denied. It's as direct as it gets. Well, if you believe that, then there's still the further claims about, well, is it right to say that you only have a human right to probabilistic stuff, to the direct protections, not to indirect? And they try to convince you that about this first claim with this analogy. So you can think about that. If you believe this, you might have to reevaluate some of your other beliefs about human rights. For instance, lots of people think there is a human right to some decent standard level of healthcare. Now, hospitals, right? Is the absence of a hospital a direct or indirect threat? Is this like an arrow or like a shield? It might be like it's not clear, right? It might be like a shield, right? Because maybe like what's killing you is the disease, right? And the hospital is the thing that's protecting you. It's like blocking the disease coming at you. Right? So maybe that's wrong. But if that looks indirect, at least at first sight to me, and if that's indirect, then if we're accepting this first premise here, then the human right to healthcare should go in. Okay, maybe it should go, right? But notice that there might be a baby that we're throwing out with bathwater here. We should check that out whenever these type of arguments are being introduced. This is a perfectly general principle about human rights, so it's going to apply to all human rights. There's a human right to education, at least primary education. Okay, yes, suppose you don't get education. Is that itself harming you? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe it's a protection against other kinds of harms, like people exploiting you or taking advantage of you and so on, right? I was talking to someone yesterday whose son had lived in Thailand for a while at a Buddhist monastery, of all places. And they lived in this rural part where they lived next to a mountain, and what they were trying to do, this monastery, was there were various women that would come down from the mountain, from the sort of rural villages. They were moving to Bangkok, where they thought the streets are paved with gold, instead of with the pimps and drug dealers that actually are waiting for them. And so what they would do is I would give them a little bit of education on the way, as well as instruction in Buddhist religion, of course, but also some basic education and some basic skills, in order to protect them from what was coming, right? So they would live up in these rural villages. There was no education there. You just grow up in the house or on the farm where you're born. So, are these people harmed when they're up there still? Or are they only harmed when they move to the city where they now become very vulnerable because they didn't get education? Yeah, maybe, right? That seems to me what the answer. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe there is some harm that's befalling them already there when they don't get education. But maybe education it's a really important tool to protect yourself from, or to get better off throughout life, but not itself a part of a good life. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But anyway, you can go through a number of human rights here, right? And start thinking, asking yourself, can I hold on to these rights given this principle? Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe I'm being overly critical here. But maybe the answer is no. And if the answer is no, that should give you pause, right, about the principle. Sometimes, it's perfectly possible that we have human rights right now that if we think about it critically, we think actually these are the wrong ones. We should keep a bunch of them, but not all of them. But maybe you think, no, this is a really important human right, so then this is a crappy principle. Right? So just remember, like the method that Altman and Wellman are using and we are using is this going back and forth, right, between principles and applications. So that's what we're doing here, right? There's is a principle, looks pretty good. They have an analogy, that's nice. But so let's apply it now to a range of cases and start asking whether If we now go back to the principle, does it still look that good to you? That's up to you, but Brian?
With both the examples of things you gave with human rights, the right to education and the right to health care, you're claiming a right to someone else's services.
Mm-hmm.
And when you boil that down, when you have a right to someone else's services, what that's claiming is someone has an obligation to
serve
to
you,
provide those services, to
Right.
do those things. And I think that seems to be a problem because that seems to be a worse human right violation if someone thinks that.
Yeah, good.
They seem to have an issue there. They have a dilemma, whoever wants to claim that you have a right to health care or you have a right to education.
Yeah, so this is a highly controversial issue. Philosophically highly controversial issue. In the human rights field or practice, actual jurisprudence and activism about human rights, this is not a controversial issue. Because people who believe what you just said, they've lost in that field. But philosophically, that's still controversial. So the idea is whether you can have rights that other people provide you with stuff. Sometimes people call this positive versus negative rights, which is a little bit of an unfortunate term. But the basic idea is that negative rights are rights that you can fulfill by not doing anything, by abstaining. Immanuel Kant believed, for example, that it was like that. Adam Smith believed that justice required only negative rights. So that Adam Smith has this famous sentence like, you can be perfectly compliant with justice by just sitting here and not doing anything. Because you wouldn't be violating anyone's rights. So that's a view often associated with kind of libertarian style thinking, which is the primary claims we have against others are claims of non-interference. To sort of leave each other alone, to put it not in a very nice way, but that's the rough idea. Whereas others, usually more on the left of the political spectrum, think actually no, we have rights to be positively provided with stuff. So rights to education, rights to healthcare would be examples of this. But there are tons of examples of this, right? So that's why I mean, like people who say that thing have lost. There's tons of rights that require active provision. As an American citizen, you have all sorts of legal rights to being provided with certain things, right? Certain states have Good Samaritan laws, for example, which is if you see someone drowning, you have to jump in and help them, like rescue them. If you can, right? If you can swim and it's safe and so on, but then you can. And if not, you can be legally held liable for that. That can be a crime. That's an example. There are also the laws about stuff that have to be provided to children. Right? There are laws about like basic welfare laws. You lose your job, you get paid by the government. Then, well, how do you get paid? Through taxation. Right? So it's other people are forced to pay for your replacement income, your welfare. So all these things are rights where you have, if they're true or just rights, you have a claim on other people that they provide you with services or money or whatever. So whether those are a good idea is controversial itself, but in human rights law is full of them. So okay.
Yeah, I followed everything you said. I'm sorry.
Right. Okay. All right. So there are two things, right? You can ask, looking back, about how evaluating this idea. Is this consistent with their earlier use of human rights, right? Maybe all human rights are probabilistic protections, or maybe some, maybe just the ones that I've been mentioning. Right? There's a more fundamental question here, right? Like if suppose we give you a human right to free speech. Are you actually being protected from having your speech not infringed? No, of course not, right? It still can happen because human rights violations happen. So what's the idea then? Well, the idea is, of course, that it makes you better protected, right? That actually the chances of being protected from having your free speech rights violated are much better when we have a system of human rights. Well, if that's the argument then maybe all of them are probabilistic. That would be a problem. But maybe it's just some, like the education and healthcare ones that I was talking about. All right. You can set that aside. This is about the secession thing about the next chapter. So forget about that. All right. Here's the third and final thing I want to talk about. So if a group has a rational will, right, and this is supposed to be the result of individual people choosing how to live together as a political group, then why can they not choose how to abolish human rights? Okay, so they cannot choose to abolish referendums because that undercuts the right to rule over themselves, right? But remember Walter, right? It's a full Walter. Walter says, yeah, but here is one way in which a government or group can govern itself. In this Algeria example, the way they govern themselves is in a kind of an oppressive way, but it's still theirs. That's how they, as a group, choose to rule themselves. So, question: what do you think someone like Altman and Wellman might respond to this? The group chooses to abolish some human rights. No more freedom of religion. Everyone has to be a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, whatever. What's the problem? Laura?
Well, then they wouldn't be seen as a legitimate state, and other states could then intervene.
Sure, yeah. And now I'm being my jerky old self, right? I say, well, why should I believe that? We were talking self-determination, right? They had a right to self-determination, right? True, right? Okay, now they decided through their referendum to abolish the right to freedom of religion. It's a big human rights violation.
Well, but they only have the right to self-determination if they follow those basic human rights laws. So then they would be seen as a legitimate state, and they wouldn't have the right to self-determination because they're breaking those laws, so other states could step in and intervene.
Yes, very good. So you're definitely on the right track here. Just let's see if we can take one more step in the explanation. And that's the thing that philosophers do, try to explicate the whole reason. Why should I think that the right to self-determination... So you're right to say that they think that the right to self-determination is limited by human rights. Why is that? So why can I not... So the self-determination right is to self-rule. Right? So I'm thinking, I'm part of a group, we get to decide how to live. And now you, Altman and Wellman, come prancing in and say, well, but it is limited by human rights. But I'm trying to choose to not have human rights. Can't do that. Why can't I not do that? Why can't I do that? Right? What's the problem? What would you say?
That's just the way that things are. Sometimes that's just how it is. I don't know. If everybody agreed, well, not everybody agreed, but if the majority agreed to go by Altman and Wellman's theory, then they would be in violation of that.
That's true, yes. Of course, we're trying to evaluate the theory, right? We're asking, like, is this a good theory or a bad? The theory says what you're saying.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I think you said what you were saying was pretty much good enough, but I'm trying to, like, really lay it out on the table. Our question is, like, why should we believe that thing that the theory is telling us? Right? Like, that's the question of, is this a good theory or not? Unless we have a good account or justification, an argument for why the theory should say that and not what I'm saying, we don't know whether this is a good or a bad theory.
Yeah, because then I guess, like, people could kill you because you're not, if you're not following those laws, then nobody else has the obligation to follow them in.
So Walter would say something like, well, that's just how these people choose to govern themselves. I'll come to you in 1 second.
But then, like, the other states, see, that's the thing is that, like, the other states could then, like, they don't have to follow laws within that, and they can even, like, could they, like, take over and force the state apart into something that's...
Well, on Walter's view, right, it's a good point, but on Walter's view, he says, actually, these other states cannot do that because the right to self-determination is in place. Now, Altman and Wellman would say, no, it's not because of these human rights violations. But I'm saying, right, well, actually, hey, Altman and Wellman, you're telling me the right to self-determination is this right to choose how we're going to live together. Here's how we choose to live together. Violate human rights. And you say, no, can't do that. Well, why not? Right? Do I have the right to choose or not?
Not within the way that society works.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, the greater society, the global community as a whole, because that is a legitimate thing. there's a global community. Whether or not we all agree on things, that's different. But
Michael, you wanted to? Yeah.
Altman and Woolman in the beginning of the book says that the most broken down version of it, the most central piece of the puzzle is that the human rights are the most indivisible right that there is. You can't separate them away from people because they're inherent in human rights.
Good. So they think that human rights take some kind of precedence over the right to self-determination. That's the idea. Chantal, did you know? I can't hear what you're saying at the end.
I'm not sure what you heard. States have the right to govern how they want it. You have to have the basic foundation of protecting and respecting human rights.
Right. Yeah, good. But what I'm pressing on is exactly why the relation should go in that direction, right? So I know they want to say that the human rights are restricting the right to self-determination. But the question I was saying, like, why shouldn't we say that the right to self-determination restricts the human rights? That seems to be Walz's view. Like Walzer says, like a self-determining group like Algeria can decide to live together in a certain way that violates human rights. He's frank about that. He doesn't say that there's no human rights violations going on in Algeria. He says, yeah, there already are. And yet these Swedes cannot come in, right? Anthony?
I was thinking I think it wouldn't be very rational for them. Just like it's illegal for like self-infliction, like for you to harm yourself. I feel like that would be them harming themselves, like just having the decision to turn on themselves. It'd be like having someone with cancer and jump in the water, and then everyone else has to sit there and watch them die. Like, you can't do that. You have to actually intervene. It'd be like a country deciding for like self-infliction. I think that would be rational at that point.
Yeah, that's interesting. That takes the same structure as the argument that Claudia gave before about the referendum, right? The argument about the referendum was that if you abolish the referendum, it's kind of like a self-defeating, like it defeats the right to self-determination itself. And you're thinking, well, maybe these human rights violations have the same feature, right? That if we allow them, it's something like the collective is turning on itself and therefore killing its own right or something like that. Yeah. Yeah, interesting. I'm not sure about that, but I have to think more. That's not Altman and Wellman's line, but it is an interesting thought. Yeah, so I think the Altman and Wellman's view is the closest to some of what Laurel was saying and what Michael was saying, which is they begin with this bedrock principle of value individualism. Right? So there has to be that whatever the right to self-determination is going to be worth, it has to be something that we can see as respecting individual people in their capacity as individuals and as group members, maybe. But it has to respect them as individuals. So you can't elevate the rights of the group over the rights of the individual. That's where that's the starting point, right? And like why? Well, we're not told, right? They say it's a liberal theory. That's just a starting assumption. Any more collectivist theory, they think, is going to be completely unacceptable out of the gate. And so now the idea would be, well, if you believe that, then to respect certain people as individuals, they have to be granted certain rights, the rights that guarantee that they're being respected as individuals. And so that's the first step, was to respect. We have to respect individuals. Second step is they have rights. And only after that come any other type of rights, like rights of self-determination. And so any of these other rights, and the very first rights that we have to be such that they respect other people's rights. So of course you have a right to freedom of movement, which means you get to swing your arms, right? But as John Stuart Mill famously said, my right to swing my arm ends where your nose begins. Right? So why? Because that's where your rights limit mine, and vice versa. My rights limit yours.
So, Walser's theory would be wrong to Altman and Woolman because self-determination also coincides with value individualism, and that's how self-determination is based off of the rights of individuals and how everybody's rights limits everyone
Right.
else's rights.
So your human rights are going to be limited by the human rights of other people. And the same has to be true then for rights of self-determination. Right? Like, so if the question was that I was pressing Laurel on, she said it pretty much anyway. But if you say, like, why can I not exercise the right to self-determination in a way that violates human rights? Well, it's because any old right has to be restricted by respect for the individual. And respect for the individual, they claim, right, they've given arguments for this, but they claim means respecting their human rights. And so just like you can't go around beating people up and say, well, I have I have a right to freedom of movement, I can swing my arms wherever. No, you actually cannot swing your arms wherever. It has to be consistent with other people's rights. And so now the argument is, well, here's the society that abolishes a certain human right. You say, well, what I can do, I have the right to self-determination, and the answer is going to be the same structure. Right? And actually, no, you only have that right consistent with the rights of others. And so that's the order of things, right? So that's why the human rights are supposed to limit. Now, democracy is not like that, right? Again, we've seen that. That's why they go through these lengths to deny that there is a human right to democracy. But, all right. Let's see. All right. So something like this, right? Human rights are among the most important ethical constraints, and that's because of this value individualism stuff that we just talked about. The exercise of all rights, including the right to self-determination and other human rights, has to be limited by the most important ethical constraints, and that includes rights and human rights. And therefore, the right to self-determination must itself be limited by human rights, at least on Altman and Wellman's view. Okay, well, you should wonder whether the worry is gone, right? Whether there really is a difference between a group choosing to abolish democracy that's not disrespecting the individuals in the way that human rights would be. But so, what exactly is the disrespect to the individuals? The question I'm raising here is this. If we say that there is a group will that has to be respected, self-determination, and this group will consists of somehow respect the individuals that make up the group in some way, shape, or form. So that if I disrespect the group will, I am disrespecting the individuals. They say that literally. Right? There's a quote in an earlier slide saying that. And now the group, and therefore the individuals that make up the group, decide to forgo their own human rights. What's the problem? Right? They can do it, they forgo their own votes, so why can they not forgo their own human rights? The answer seems to be, well, because it's other human rights you're giving up, but I thought it was ourselves that were doing it, right? Like us as group members. So there seems to be something slippery going on here, where sometimes it is self-determination is you as a group member being respected or disrespected. And then at other times it's, well, but your actions have to be limited by the rights of others. But I thought it was me. Right? It was me who's doing self-governing here. That's why Rousseau thinks there are no human rights constraints. Because you decide for yourself which rights you have and which rights you don't have as a community member together with everybody else who also decides for themselves. Right? Or if we can give up on our own rights or human rights, well, why can we not also give up on democracy, right? For ourselves or for others? I'm genuinely not sure about how to answer these questions. I think these are the kind of questions that if we figure out what the answer is, we'll get a really good understanding of what Altman and Wellman think of self-determination. If you figure it out, let me know. All right. Let me see. The end. All right. We've got 2 minutes. Does anyone have any questions for today, or for Tuesday that you want addressed before we end? All right. If something comes up, send me an email. And otherwise, I'll see you next week.